Well, it really is a billionaire's nightmare. Powerful tech giants, Mark Zuckerberg, we'd heard about. They're facing tough questions and grieving families, giving allegations that social media addiction just pushed youngsters beyond their limits. Several, we heard, taking their own lives. Talk to us about what's at the core of these accusations.
Well, you hit on the fact of grieving families, and that to me, setting aside the legal questions here, that's I think what makes this case so interesting to look at. It's one thing for Mark Zuckerberg to go to Washington, to go to Capitol Hill, to talk to members of Congress. It's another thing to have a series of grieving families either in a courtroom or ready to talk to the media, or perhaps already have talked to the media, and they become real faces, real stories, real children who have been, um, according to their parents, affected by this in some form or fashion. If you think about any kind of addiction, it often starts very innocently.
Hmm.
And in much the same way that it becomes easy to either eat too much because the chocolate cake tastes really good, or stay up too late playing video games, or whatever the case might be. One of the challenges really facing here is, did Meta as a whole do enough, and other tech companies as well? Did they do enough to basically put enough safeguards in so that the most vulnerable of their users, the youngest people, would be able to turn it off, or at least understand that it was time to go somewhere else and do something else?
Yeah.
It's going to be, I think, a fine line for them to argue. On one hand, it is socially exciting, and there are opportunities and there are games, and
Yeah.
on the other hand, to try to convince a jury that, you know what, if you're 12 or 13 years old, maybe you should have enough common sense to step away.
Yeah. Also, you talked about the kind of the core of this, that Zuckerberg has famously testified on Capitol Hill a decent amount, but now he's under oath. What's his stance? And from his perspective, what's at stake?
I think if I'm him, one of the challenges that came up today, for example, was the acknowledgement of an email. I believe it was 2015, may have been 2016. I don't remember off the top of my head, in which there was an acknowledgement from him that, look, we want to do what we can so that more people, especially young people, spend more time on this app, because obviously more time, more attention from advertisers, more money, et cetera, et cetera. So, on one hand, he has to square that, yes, in the past, this may have been what we did, but he's able to say, or is eager to say, this is what we've done now, or this is what we've done since then. The problem is that the prosecution and perhaps the jury is going to say, okay, but wait a minute. Back here is when the young woman in question, and when other people of a similar age began to show signs of either addiction or depression or whatever, that very well might have been connected to spending too much time on this app. In effect, by saying we changed things, aren't you acknowledging that you had a problem, and
Yeah.
therefore doesn't that increase the prosecution's case? It's a very fine line he has to walk here.
Yeah, but secondly, with this landmark trial, it has to be proven that entities such as Meta and Google are deliberately designing algorithms to hook kids on social media. It has to be beyond reasonable doubt.
It does, and it's comparisons are sometimes good, sometimes bad. But if you think back to some of the landmark trials regarding smoking and nicotine addiction and all of that from a couple of decades ago, you had the same sort of challenge there, and there was an opportunity, and there was a successful opportunity made by lawyers to
Mm.
say, look, there are certainly problems with cigarettes. Now, again, I'm not comparing the two and saying the situations are identical. But no doubt, you're absolutely right. It's one thing to say this could have happened. It's another thing to say this definitely did happen.
Right.
And that's, again, I think, you talk about walking that fine line. That's the challenge that the prosecution is going to have, is to be able to connect addiction directly to these apps, or addictive behavior rather directly to these apps.
Yeah, and indeed, the jury, the court must put all other media out of its thought process when they're doing this. But talk about the significance of this trial is coming on the heels of recent bans in countries like Australia
Hmm.
and Spain. Do you think that is going to play into this as well? Perhaps, not in their main thought, but it's got to be there in the back of their minds.
No doubt, and I think what you're likely to hear in the next couple of days or couple of weeks is, look, okay, these countries, whether they be in Australia, whether they be in Europe, whatever the case might be, you're trying to perhaps compare apples to oranges
Right,
here.
right,
This
right.
is not the U.S. market. This is not similar circumstances. I don't know if that's going to be a strong argument to make, but no doubt what they're going to essentially say, if again you're on the prosecution side, is that look, there are enough countries around the world that are catching up, and they're realizing there may be a need to put a limit on what young people and teenagers are able to do. Now, whether the jury connects that necessarily to addictive behavior directly responsible for the app, again, that's the question we don't yet obviously have an answer to.